Good afternoon, everyone. The topic of this talk is Hemi Sync and remote viewing, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about what is Hemi Sync. Obviously, it's a audio guidance program developed by the Monroe Institute for obtaining altered states of consciousness. And now I need to kind of make the segue. Well, how does that, altered states of consciousness thing and the Hemi Sync technology, how does that go over into the world of remote viewing? Now, for those of you who have no idea what remote viewing is, it seems to be the mental ability to perceive and then describe things that are blocked from your normal senses because they're too far away, or they're on the other side of the wall, or they're away from you in time, like in the past or in the future. So they have used remote viewing in archaeology, and they've used remote viewing to look at future events and future happenings, because that time blocks our normal physical senses. But also remote viewing in terms of objects that are hidden or events that happen thousands of miles away. The difference between remote viewing and your prophetic vision or your psychic reading that you call up to get, or you sit with somebody and have them give you a psychic reading, the difference is that remote viewing grew out of the laboratory. The idea that when you say I am a remote viewer, or when you say I did a remote viewing, those of us who have been involved in it hear what you're saying, but this was done under protocol-controlled, structured conditions. Not, I had a dream last night that my daughter was going to have a car accident, and sure enough she did. I'm a remote viewer. No, that was an accurate prophetic dream. But it wasn't remote viewing, because remote viewing, to our standards, means that it's done under a specific controlled situation. Usually meaning that you work with another person, an interviewer, and you have somebody called an interviewer or monitor and a remote viewer, and those two people have very distinct roles in the act of perceiving and describing the target, and neither of them have a clue. It's called being blind to the target. Neither of them have a clue as to what is supposed to be described. Let me explain to you what the typical initial protocol at Stanford Research Institute was. We worked with Dr. Putoff and Russell Targ, and a remote viewer would go out there for evaluation, and in the morning you might have coffee together, and then at about 9:30 you and Russell Targ would be taken away and taken into a room and kept in that room. Once you were in the room, then Dr. Putoff would generate a random number with his computer, and it would say envelope 152. He would go to the safe and open up and get envelope 152. He had no idea what was in 152, but he would drive away from SRI. When he was a couple of blocks away, he opens the envelope, and it says, go to the marina, go to McDonald's, or go to the wharf, or go to the university tower, whatever is the selected site. And then he would drive to that site. And his job was to interact with the site in some way. If it was a park bench, sit on the park bench. If it was a library, go into the library and look at books. If it was McDonald's, go in and order a burger and a shake. Or he was supposed to interact with this area in the normal course of how you're supposed to interact with that area. Meanwhile, back at the room with the remote viewer and Russell Targ, at 10 o'clock, they would say, okay, interviewer would say to the remote viewer, it's now 10 o'clock, describe Dr. Putoff's location. And then they would attempt to describe where he was. The interviewer asking questions like, tell me more about that. You mentioned such and such. Tell me a little bit more about that. Why did you say that? Don't get too far afraid now. Just tell me the raw perception you had. Don't draw any conclusions. So working together, then they would attempt to describe, where did Dr. Putoff go? So when I say remote viewing, that's what I mean. I mean this very controlled, organized situation Afterwards, after they tried to describe, then Dr. Putoff would return, and all three of them would get in the car and go out to the location. And that way, the remote viewer and interviewer would learn, gee, when I talked about the green, that was there, and I talked about a big, tall, white structure, that was there, but when I said red car, that didn't have anything to do with anything. So they learn by seeing it first person and compare it with the kinds of intuitive impressions they had and learn from that repeated practice. So if you go to get a psychic reading from someone, that's not remote viewing. If you have a prophetic dream, that's not remote viewing. They may be perfectly accurate, and they're certainly psychic perceptions, but within the confines of what is remote viewing, when you're talking to Mr. Lab like me, that's not remote viewing. We mean something different, this controlled procedure, scientifically designed, protocol-driven, structured process. Monroe Institute. What is the Monroe Institute? How many have heard of Robert Monroe, the out-of-body guy? Almost everybody. Robert Monroe was a businessman in the 40s and 50s in the heyday of radio. Do any of you remember the radio show, The Shadow? Well, Mr. Monroe actually produced the program, The Shadow. This place called the Monroe Institute. I went down to the Monroe Institute and met Mr. Monroe. Now you can't, he lived at this place called the Whistlefield Farm then, which was not where the Monroe Institute's located right now. And I met him in his little screened-in porch there. And I couldn't say to him, Mr. Monroe, I'm with this secret program where we're going to try to train remote viewers, because it was secret. You can't tell him about it, right? Well, that was circa 1977. How does this stuff work? Well, this stuff called binaural beating. We talked about two different sounds, one coming into one ear and the other sound coming into the other ear. Inside the brain, when they come together, inside the brain, something else happens. They combine and make a amplitude modulated, amplitude means volume, amplitude modulated standing wave at the exact pulse rate of the difference between the two sounds. Now that's important because our ears can't hear really low sounds below about 20 cycles per second, and yet our brain waves are down there, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10 cycles per second. So the way to get down to that brainwave state is by putting two sounds slightly different, 300 cycles per second, 304 cycles per second, the difference being 4 cycles per second, wah, 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 wah. And that pulsing is going to be wah, 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 wah at 4 cycles per second when you use the two different sounds. Now the first place that occurs inside the brain is called the olivary nuclei, or the hearing centers of the brain, right next door to the reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is what sends up the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, balancing with serotonin and noradrenaline at any point on the cortex, and thereby change the brainwave state. It is the reticular that's involved in changing the arousal state. And the arousal state of your brain is different than your own personal experience. You can't tell what a person is thinking or the experience they're having by looking at their brain waves. You can only tell how aroused different parts of the brain are. It's like saying, oh, I can tell you you're in the dream state and you're in the dream state, but I don't have a clue what you're dreaming about. So when somebody asks you, listen, you went to that talk, Skip Atwater and Hemi Sync, how does that Hemi Sync stuff work anyway? Well, you want to say it works really well. Okay? You don't start off with all these brain pictures and the reticular activating system and the brain stem and the olivary nuclei and neurotransmitters. Just say it works really well. See how that goes for you. We're trying to change incoherent brainwave patterns into coherent brainwave patterns with this Hemi Sync sound.